Look at that, live.
Okay.
Click a bit.
Did great.
Hi. I'm Steve, and with me is
I am Megan.
Megan. And we are going to, after this bumpy ride in YouTube world, and we have a ring light, so Megan and I can't see you, so you can make faces at us, and we'll never know. We're going to discuss women in the American Revolution, and this is kind of an overview, and what we want to do is touch on some of the topics that we're going to discuss in the podcast, where we'll get more in depth. The idea is to look at how the revolution impacted women, how they participated in or didn't participate in, and how things changed for them prior to and after after the war began, and not necessarily after the revolution. You can jump right in, Marty. What can I do?
I just got a question. Is
Sure.
this women locally or women in the revolution as a whole?
Yes. Yes, the answer to that is yes. We're going to examine women as a whole, and we're going to talk some specific. We're going to use women locally, especially Lucretia Shaw, and actually she's in the Web Saver, a picture of Lucretia. We're going to talk about Lucretia Shaw. We'll talk about a little bit about Abigail Hinman, Elizabeth Poole, and a couple other people. We'll also mention other women in the colonies during the American Revolution and how they participated. And we can see some of the examples of changes with some of the women I just mentioned. And our hope is to expand this into the podcast where we'll really examine women across class and race and even religion. So we're going to start by reading a couple, and when I say we, I mean Megan. Megan is going to start us off by reading a couple letters written by Elizabeth Poole. And she's writing her brother in, was it New Jersey, right? He was in New Jersey.
Yes.
So she's writing her brother in New Jersey, and her husband is a privateer. And if those of you who've heard me speak before or watched one of the other videos, you've heard me talk ad nauseum about privateers. Well, her husband signed on board, and he went on a trip. A typical privateer trip was 2 weeks, and he'd been gone longer than 2 weeks. So she discovered that he had been taken prisoner, and he was being held by the British. So she was writing her brother about this, and that's where this letter begins.
Yeah, so we're going to begin today in New London, the 16th of November, 1779. My dear brother, misfortune on misfortune, grief on grief. For what you distress, am I yet reserved? I do not know. Marked out from my birth, the sport of equal fortune, how cruel in most instances have her smallest favors been withheld. Sorrow and disappointment have constantly attended me through the varying scenes of life. Yet, I would by no means be insensible of the divine favor, nor blind to my daily experience of the mighty protection. 'Tis that divine support alone that can enable me to bear, becoming fortitude, the seeing unjust aftermath of his unerring providence. 'Tis 3 weeks, last Friday, since Captain Packer sailed from this place with only a fortnight's provision. You can better imagine than I describe the distress I have felt since the usual time of hearing from them has lapsed. 'Tis now said they are taken and carried into New York, but we have yet no certain amount of it. In part, you may realize my impatience to hear, my fears continually painting the most alarming and melancholy prospects. The ill state of my health, in which Mr. Poole left home, adds great to my gloomy apprehensions. I write this time only to give you this disagreeable intelligence, for the confused state of my mind scarcely allows me to write at all. But whatever my situation believe me to be, your unalterable friend, Mrs. Poole.
So, let's talk a little bit about that. Um, what's happening here is she's writing her brother, because she can't negotiate with the British. And why is that?
Yeah, so the reason for this is because of curvature. And so what this means is a legal doctrine, and this merges married women with their husbands. And so they have no ability to own their own property, make contracts, or control wages. So her husband's out at sea. She's not hearing from him. She's basically cut off. So she's reaching out to the only male figure in her life because she's struggling right now. She has no support system. She can't negotiate with the British. We can see in her letter she's very distressed. She needs some form of help.
So, and what's unusual about this is that prior to the American Revolution, when we were the colonies, women enjoyed more agency in regard to property ownership or business management or being able to negotiate things. And even in the war, when their husbands left, and especially in this area, we can, in this area, sorry, I lost my train of thought, especially in this area, Connecticut, all right? So we're maritime world, women are used to their husbands being gone. And they enjoyed a great deal of agency in regard to that because Laurel Thatcher describes this, especially during the American Revolution, is they became deputy husbands. They had to maintain the family estate, they had to maintain the household, they had to ensure money was going in, they had to pay bills. So the idea that they couldn't engage in any kind of legal activity was untenable in order to support the colony. So you saw this agency in the colonies, and women enjoyed that. And then during the American Revolution, it kind of expanded. We'll talk about that in a minute. But in Connecticut, they began passing laws to narrow that scope. So Connecticut was the only state at the time that actually said, no, this isn't the reason. Now, women worked around that because there's always agency against authority. But what you're seeing as women moving in, and there are a couple of reasons why I'm going into that in a bit. So let's talk about. We want to move on, or we want to read the next letter?
We could read the next.
Okay, let's read the next letter. This is her talking 2 years later to her brother.
Yeah. So we're in New London, January 7th, 1781. So like Steve said, 2 weeks later. Nothing, my brother, affords such pleasing relief to distress as the sympathy for real friendships, since friends grow not thick on every bough, not every friend unrotten at the core. How highly ought we esteem the inestimable blessing of true and faithful friend. In this light I have ever regarded my brother. To him alone I wish to unburthen the oppressive load of sorrow that almost sinks me in despair. My last to you was dictated by a mind bereft of every hope, and so feelingly affected with sufferings of a tender partner as required every effort to enable me to act with becoming composure. Must now confess my spirit perhaps too much elated with agreeable intelligence contained in your kind's letter by the next post. One enclosed to Mr. Holland had before wrecked the third. He mentioned to have wrote, suppose come by the intercepted mail, which went to Long Island. Hoped it contained nothing that could be the least disservice to our dear unfortunate sufferer. I yesterday heard again from Mr. Poole by Mr. Phillips, who came out of the Provost the 25th ultimo. He was then confined only in the common prison, but had before that enlargement suffered more than I can imagined, their utmost malice capable of inflicting no hopes that I can find. As you falter me of his releasement, your friend, Elizabeth.
So she was relieved because her husband was in Long Island in a prison. He wasn't on one of the prison hulks, which more often than not killed people who were captive there. It also explains why he was so long in prison, because instead of being on a prison hulk, Thomas Shaw would arrange for prisoner exchanges, and he would, they would get him off the hulks as quickly as possible. A prison hulk is a ship that they take, they demast it, they anchor it, and they use it as a prison. Connecticut actually used the silver mine as a prison in the northwestern section of Connecticut. They used imprisoned British soldiers in a silver mine. So that's what she's happy about, but her brother's letter did the trick, right? She got news and her husband was released. What we're seeing is a women's agency against authority. At birth, you're assigned, right? You're assigned a gender, and then you're given these rules in which you have to live. So you had a role to play, both husband and wife. You had a role to play. And a wife's role, she was marginalized, and as Megan said, she was thought in terms of her husband. So from there, you need, we're entering the American Revolution, and we're going to talk a little bit about Lucretia Shaw and Nathaniel Shaw. So Nathaniel Shaw, from my lecture previously, he was the Navy agent for the colony of Connecticut. And he wasn't away, but he was here, but he was managing and administering the Navy and the privateers that were coming in and out of Connecticut. It was a Herculean job in correspondence alone. And Lucretia had her role to play. She had to manage the house. She had to manage the staff. She had to ensure that money and foodstuffs were coming in. She also had to be ready to entertain at the drop of the hat heads of state. George Washington came here. Jonathan Trumbull was a good friend of Nathaniel Shaw, and he dined here all the time. So she had that obligation, plus her family who was here. They were 10 enslaved people who were here that she had to take care of and manage. And all the while she did this, and she would often talk with her husband. You would see other women who were literate who could do this, and they did the same kinds of things, and they would correspond with their husbands. So they were running it, but they would talk back and forth with their husbands. So even still, their husbands were kind of running things. But the unique part of that was that it changed their relationship status within the marriage. It made it more of a partnership. So women also all of a sudden gained more agency and became partners because they were military spouses. And in essence, sometimes widows, but they would often call themselves, I feel widowed in their correspondence. I'm acting like a widow.
Yeah. A good example of that,
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Jump
It's
right in.
Kathleen Green. So Kathleen Green, she was a Southern spouse, and she was able to run the plantation and their businesses all while her husband was on the war front. And she managed wartime supply chains as well, and she hosted many military councils. And there is some writings that said that she did a better job than her husband. So then now we're kind of talking about when these husbands come home, there's a control that the wives have, and that feeling of control sometimes is hard to let go because when their husbands come home, they have control over everything. But now they have some ideas of, oh, I could have done this better, or I would have made a different decision. And once you have control of everything, it's hard to let that go. And Steve brought up the great point of military spouses, and we've seen it kind of started like throughout the French and Indian War through the Revolution, and a lot of because of the control that they have with the finances, making every single decision, really led into the talk of maybe I can do this on my own and I don't need a husband, I can make my own decisions, maybe I can buy some land for myself. So a lot of discussions could come out of this point. It's really cool.
Then you have women who aren't literate, who don't have to check with their husbands. They just make the choices. However, the problems that they run into are their fault, but ironically, they're protected by coverage because she is actually her husband, and he would be the one who would be penalized for her choices economically. And what it really is interesting, and why even when Connecticut said women can't negotiate, can't sign contracts, those kinds of things, they still, as widows, could go into business. And they also they looked a little bit away because when the colonies began, they weren't allowed to trade with Europe. They weren't allowed to sell manufactured goods to England. And in their response, they created a huge trade network throughout the colonies. So they were trading with each other, and they were trading in the Caribbean. So any British colony, they would trade with each other. And it became almost a pseudo country with its own economy. So now you have the war and the men who are engaged in this economy, but ironically not driving the consumerism because it's women who are deciding what products are being bought. But the goods aren't going to be moved or bought because of the men not being around. So you see women gain agency because of these economic moves. They had to keep the economy running. So they allowed women to participate, but they never gave them the freedom to act. But they did turn an eye to if a woman wanted to start a business, she could if she was a widow, but it had to be within the role she was assigned. So tavern keeper or boarding house, she could be a seamstress. And if she couldn't sign into a contract, she couldn't incorporate. So even then, they were still marginalizing and controlling women in that regard. So with Lucretia and Nathaniel, they became partners. And even Lucretia, we talked about prison homes. Lucretia died because of her role, because women were expected to nurture. And she was caring for some of the men who came off the prison hulks, and they had ship sickness, which was typhus. And she caught it in 1781 and died in December of that year from the prisoner she was.
Would this environment create an element of marital strife?
Well, the research at this point, it all depends. You know what it is? It depends if you were literate or illiterate. The research is showing that women and men who corresponded and enjoyed that, because they were just corresponding back and forth, it became a negotiation. And then men, more often, especially because their livelihoods were involved, saw that women, because you see this in Nathaniel and Lucretia Shaw and Abigail and John Adams, their relationship became stronger and they became partners. Because I think men's attitudes, and this is speculation, but it appears as though men's attitudes changed when this happened. And it also allowed them to be free to pursue and do other things because women were taking care of some of the details at home. So that's what I've read 3 papers, and that's what the research bears out in that regard. But again, this is women's history, so more research needs to happen, and they're still kind of deciding how they want to examine it. If I was to go into it more, I would really look at the impact of the financial statement I just made. It seems when money is involved and the loss of money is involved, more allowances are made. And that's what appears to be happening here, is that we need the economy to run. So we'll allow women to do this. And I keep using the word agency because I can say freedom, but freedom is not a freedom. It wasn't a freedom. They were never free. Deputy husband was a thing. They were allowed to affect change in a broader scale. And that was in regard to, and it was irrespective of class, because even smaller homes still had to put food on the table and had to engage in commerce, I think Megan did some research about women participating in, and making money in that regard. I read, they
Yeah.
were being paid a little bit by the government to knit socks and stuff.
Yeah. We do have a couple cases. Yeah, so we did see direct political and military action with women. An example of this, of women raising money, is Esther D. Bertree. In 1780, she wrote the Sentiments of American Women, and she herself led a door-to-door fundraising campaign, and she herself, with her organization, raised over $300,000 for Washington's Continental Army, which is a lot of money, and she was able to do all this, organize this fundraiser just weeks after giving birth to her sixth child. So they were handling and raising money here. They believed in the war effort. And then another case of women handling money is Mary Catherine Goddard, and she's Baltimore's postmaker from 1775 to 1789, and she is likely the nation's first female federal employee. And so she printed the first official copy of the Declaration of Independence, and it bears the signatures, names, typesetting her name in history books. And so I found that very fascinating, because $300,000 is a lot of money.
It's $60 million
Yeah.
today.
$60
It would be
million.
$60 million.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. So they were definitely, and after giving birth to a sixth child, so
She was motivated.
very motivated. Yeah, yeah. So we're seeing different ways women are motivating. We talked about the private sphere with the home. We touched on political actions, and then very interesting, if I'm able to. Yeah. This was very interesting research that I came across. This is the first time that we're seeing it in the colonies, is surviving and resisting sexual violence in the colonies. Because husbands were around, fathers weren't around, women stuck together, protected themselves, and women confronted sexual assault not as a passive victims, but as political actors navigating military occupation. So, because women were protecting themselves, this is the first time that we're seeing women filing official complaints, and they sought protection from officers and used community networks to demand justice. So these community networks were often other women. A lot of times they would create mobs, or they would, if it was a loyalist being accused, they would gather up some patriots. If it was a patriot being accused, then they would gather up loyalists. And these actions, they made these accusations, and if attacks were to happen, they forced the Continental and the British commanders to create and revise military policies. And so this means body autonomy, legal action, and putting pressure on the public. And women were not standing alone anymore, and it wasn't something that was shunned away in the home. It was something that, this is a crime that took place, and I want justice for it. And that goes back to, they were protecting themselves. That's all they had, was each other. And it was also a bargaining chip as well, between officers, between occupied cities, in that regard as well.
So, this was on both sides, the colonies and the British. And it wasn't just officer complaints, they were arguing these grievances in Parliament and Congress. So it went all the way there. The other thing, and what you're seeing, and you see this push against it, you have to look at this in the context of hospitality. there was an obligation of hospitality. Women were required to offer hospitality, period. And it didn't matter what side you were on. So if British soldiers came to a patriot household, they had an expectation of hospitality. Okay, in the case of Massachusetts, and I didn't even talk about this, Bathsheba Spooner used to kill her husband, and they put him down a well. So Spooner's Well, this is in Massachusetts, and eventually they hanged her, by the way, in Worcester, Mass. So there was an obligation of hospitality, and then these kinds of things began to happen. The other thing you see is within the upper officer ranks, you see this mingling of loyalists and not even occupied people and the occupiers. So it could be British with colonial upper class women or Americans and upper class loyalist women. Benedict Arnold, as governor of Pennsylvania, married a loyalist. They would have parties together, they would do dances, and this was not uncommon. So you see these kinds of interactions and interplay throughout the American Revolution. And now we see this born out of it and this kind of agency happening. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to holler out. This is really kind of a relaxed kind of discussion. Checking. Let's talk about women fighting as men. Okay. So passing was the thing. It wasn't surprising that when women would dress up like men, women would dress up like men to go to sea. But you have some women who dress up like men. So let's talk a little bit about how women participated actually.
Yeah, so a good example of this is Deborah Sampson. And so she disguised herself as a man to join the 4th Massachusetts Regiment in 1782. So she fought in skirmishes, she was wounded, and even removed a bullet from her thigh. So she bled for this cause, and she did that with a penknife. And it's interesting looking at the reaction of women who fought for the revolution, depending on where you're at. So Deborah Sampson was in Massachusetts. Some women were given pensions. They were highly regarded. They fought for the cause, and they were put on a different pedestal than women in the South, for example. Steve, I know you did some research on.
There was a woman in Virginia,
Yeah.
and I didn't write her name down. I saw it briefly, but I actually have another one on top of it as well. When she was discovered, they kicked her out of the service and jailed her for a year. But also I want to mention Sally St. Clair, who was a Creole woman in Georgia, who passed as a man and fought the entire American Revolution. And at the Battle of Savannah in 1782, at the end of the war, she was killed. And when they undressed her, it was only then they found out she was a woman. So this was a woman of color who participated in the American Revolution as a man. You also have Anna Bailey at Groton and what she did, right? Stripping her petticoats for wadding in the guns. I saw a number of different narratives in that regard. Most of them are taken from what Francis Cawthon's wrote. So she was over there, and I would not be surprised if they had to steal the gunpowder for the cannons over at Fort Griswold when Arnold raided. And then Abigail Hinman, who reputedly took a shot at Benedict Arnold, her own family. The story has been embellished over the years, but her own family record, there's Matt Reardon discussed it in his book. Their own family records is when he left, she went up on the roof and took a shot at him. But that's what the family record says. But if you read other narratives, it's gotten much, much larger. Which, and that's a good thing, right? They found these women and they upheld them, and they painted them with virtue, and they lot of them as heroes, but only after the revolution was over. Within the revolution, women were still expected to maintain their place. And you had only specific jobs, and they were always defined in terms of men. Caring for men, caring for the family, nurturing. You were limited as to what you were allowed to do. And as I said, you gained agency. And prior to that, because of the needs of the colony, you didn't have more agency. But then by the revolution, there were more men here, and all of a sudden you start seeing these laws cropping up and narrowing their agency, and it only got worse up through the 19th century. And we're talking about bank accounts, right? Women being involved in bank accounts. I've had so many conversations. I don't know if that was with you. Not in these notes, but it's just even women being able to open bank accounts on their own was not a thing.
Until what, 1975?
So,
Is that
yeah,
what we just?
1975.
1975. Wild.
I want to go back to a point you said about the strict rules for women. So we discussed a lot about what elite women were doing, middle class women were doing during the revolution. A lot of lower class women were camp followers, and so these were women who chose to travel with the armies. And George Washington, he saw them as a headache because he saw that they were distracting his troops. They were getting in the way. Towards the end, he wanted them to support the war front by providing his troops with meals, with medical attention. And a lot of these women who decided to be camp followers did not have a choice. So they were refugee women, and they made the decision about where to flee, whom to trust, and how to survive. And a lot of them believed surviving, the best decision was to follow the armies around, because they had nowhere to go back to. Like we talked about, they couldn't own land, they couldn't buy land, so this was their only option.
And we talked for about 35 minutes, and we didn't mention the homespun.
Oh, yeah. There's so many avenues that you could go through. Yeah.
So, we learned about the homespun movement. It was kind of crystallized, and it's looked like this moment for women. It was actually political action. All right. As I mentioned before, women decided what products were being bought and sold. They determined markets because they were the ones who were saying, well, this product is good, this product is bad. So you're starting to see, I imagine with the exception of the gunpowder market, right? But other than that, so the homespun movement appeared to be women saying, we're going to punish the British by wearing homespun. Okay? But it was bigger than that. So the Navigation Acts restricted the kind of trade that the colonies could do. And they weren't allowed to sell. They weren't allowed to manufacture and sell goods. I could sell rings and ends and slats for barrels, but I couldn't sell the manufactured barrel. I could sell barrels to Pennsylvania or Bermuda, but I couldn't sell them to Britain or Europe. And then any manufactured goods coming here, you had to buy from Britain. So women were saying, we're not going to buy textiles, but they weren't going to buy any goods that they could, which why coffee became popular here, because they stopped drinking tea. So, and what did the British do? They decided to start raising the price on coffee. But women in other countries who were relatives here were gifting coffee to the Americans because they could get it so cheap. It was only expensive here in America. So women would wear homespun, but they were actually boycotting all British manufactured goods. But the textiles was the biggest market, which was really fascinating. I went down that in that regard, because I heard of the homespun movement, and we talk about it. It's like Molly Sampson, when you Google women who fight as a man, everything comes up Molly Sampson. You really have to, in order to find out about more women, you have to disable AI, because Molly Sampson has written about so much. So it was really interesting, but now you have these rich women not buying textiles and they're wearing homespun, right? So it's a protest, but there are women who just wore homespun because that's all they could afford. So they kind of got caught up in that whole movement. And then in one of the Elizabeth Poole letters, we have several of them, she describes Benedict Arnold's raid on the and she talks about the British soldiers entering houses and they were finding women's garments and they were tearing them up. And it was in response to the homespun.
And I know we talked about this with the homespun movement, about agency against authority, about how the homespun movement, making your own textiles, how that was seen as a form of acceptable protest for women. And we were talking about trying to figure out what ways women stepped out of that role, of completely being in the patriarchal lens, when we were discussing it.
So, and that goes by, women were allowed to act within the rules that they were assigned. And it was the unusual, mainly the women who dressed as men, to fight, because that was the only. So, but that was, you have to think about that in order to step out of their assigned role, they had to pretend to be a man. So being deputy husband wasn't enough in order to, and that reinforces the agency act. In order to find true freedom, they literally had to become in order to get that freedom. So that's why I keep using the word agency in regard to women. And then you see the irony of that agency across classes, where a literate woman can be more controlled than a male woman, because if her husband's gone, she has the freedom to do what she wants, which in turn would likely cause that marital strife, especially when they came home, because she was making other choices. Benedict Arnold ignored his sister when she managed his affairs and lost all his money. And that's right, and British didn't pay him enough to do what they did. Are there any questions? I think we've covered about everything we want to cover. Are there any questions? Yeah, so, go ahead, talk about
I mean, London being a seafaring town,
yes.
I mean, I would think the waterfront would have been an interesting place for women.
Well, you're looking at, all right, so we're going in, and this is irrespective of the American Revolution here, it's a maritime world. So, because women's husbands were mariners, they had more cosmopolitan ideas. You hear it in the North End, prior to the Revolution, young women having the audacity to run around without bonnets because Boston was so they were defying convention. But women also had to argue for their own rights because sailors would go away and they wouldn't send their pay home. So they would have to go there and they would have to manage that. There was the same expectation. All of a sudden, these women, and that's why you don't see that bump here in Connecticut. Women weren't surprised when they had to take on financial matters because their husbands were gone for years, 3 years. A voyage could be 3-4 years. So, and even if you're corresponding with that person, it's going to take time for those letters to go. So, women were societally, in comparison to other places, in the maritime world, women had more agency because of economy.
But it seems like, education and station in life, big factor here.
Well, yes,
As it does that to a degree.
but we're talking about, yes, we are, but we're talking about class agency. You know, so, a woman of means would have more ability to affect change within her means, but her husband would always have the ability to control her more, which is likely why when women corresponded, they managed to get that partnership. A woman was not literate, couldn't afford paper. She didn't have to check with her husband. She would do what she had to do, knowing she was cloaked in the safety of coverage. So even if she made a mistake, her husband was going to be blamed because he was the one who owned her. So it would make for a very interesting family relationship. So yeah, it's perspective, right? So Lucretia Shaw, I keep looking at when I say women of means. Lucretia Shaw is a woman of means. I'm looking at her portrait with double choker and pearls and in a satin gown, okay, and there's a gold ring on her finger, and just she's a woman of means. She didn't want for anything. All right, Nathaniel Shaw in 1779 built the General Israel Putnam for $50,000. He had $10 million to throw at a ship. She wasn't not getting tea. Okay. However, when she made choices, whether it was permission or forgiveness in the correspondence, she still spoke with her husband. Even if he wasn't here, she would correspond with him. But he was typically here, so I'm sure they discussed at least every day or every other day the choices she made, the things she needed, the things she wanted. If a woman on the waterfront and her husband's at sea, she didn't have to check in with him at all.
When earlier you referenced John Adams and Abigail, John Adams was away from home a lot.
They corresponded a lot,
And
volumes.
And that they did.
Volumes. And in the end, he's often quoted he often stood out of her way. If you read some of his letters, Abigail, in essence, as it went further on, almost had a free hand at times. And there were some, he picked his battles, let's put it that way. John Adams picked his battles, and he was smart to do it. So, especially when she became politically active, Abigail Adams became politically active. He stepped back and he didn't get in the way. So, and I literally said, let her do it. He let her do it. And that speaks of a very deep relationship and a fondness and a partnership.
Yeah, I mean, from what I've read, and it seems that their relationship is extraordinary.
This
Not the norm.
Do we have any other questions, comments? Okay, how do we do? Oh, 7:46, 45 minutes, not bad. So I'd like to thank the people here who came and the people who tuned in, and we'll keep doing the YouTube thing until we get it right, until we get the microphones right. We figured out which computer we can use, and as we move along, hopefully these will get better. The next one is, Becca, what's the next one?
One moment.
It's Juneteenth, so it's African Americans in history and the revolution, isn't it?
Yes, I'm getting your date.
Okay.
Is it next month or is it?
It'll be Juneteenth. It'll be the Thursday before the event. Should work these in. I should have, not me. I should have. It's my fault. So,
Do you recommend any books that would be interesting? Like super scholarly books, but just anything that you think is accessible for revolutionary time, not necessarily on women, but
just overall,
yeah, for like New London.
Wow. Well, the problem is I don't read. I don't. Well, Nat Philbrick did a good book on Washington and Arnold, which is pretty kind of public history. Damien Pergot and Dane Ruth just published some books about a couple of patriots that are around. Matt Reardon's Benedict Arnold book is good. I'm mired in things like Connecticut's Naval Office by Ernest Rogers, but that's not.
Super accessible.
Well, no, it's accessible. You can get it, but it's more, and it's actually it's good for what it is. It's not a scholarly book, but Megan's got a bibliography as well. A lot of the research we did was academic journals, papers, and primary sources. Go ahead.
One of the resources I really liked, and I liked how it was spaced up, was Women Waging War in the American Revolution by Robert Parkinson. That's a really great resource for an overture.
I'm sorry, Robert.
Parkinson.
Okay, I do have that next date. So the next date is going to be on June 18th, 7 to 8, and it is Revolution and Enslavement.
And then we take the hiatus, right, in July because the kids are here. So we'll be doing summer program.
So you do have, there is also July 16th from 7 to 8, the Free Port of New London.
Okay.
August 8th, 7 to 8, Revolution from the Pulpit, which would be very interesting.
Congregational ministers.
Yes.
Preaching revolution.
September 12th from 3 to 4 p.m. because, as you know, that's the big Benedict Arnold Day. So from 3 to 4, it's Benedict in Red, why he turned coat. And then October 8th from 7 to 8 p.m., Indigenous people in the Revolution.
And Meg and I are teaming up again for that. And I'm hoping, I'm convinced Nicole Thomas to do Revolution and Enslavement. I've asked her, she's thinking. So now I'm calling her out.
Go on, Nicole.
And I'm just thinking of the other things we've got going. Summer camp, summer program is coming up,
Mhm.
and that starts in July. We're going to be increasing our offerings for field trips. They're coming up, and we are going to, this is my favorite thing that we just came up with. We're going to do a nefarious genealogy. Tell us the stories of your black sheep. We're going to give people 5 minutes, and we're going to do a story slam about the nefarious members of their family in genealogy. And this was born out of a certain researcher who came here and I opened up and we had something on one of her relatives and she looked for him and we had one document and it turned out it was a warrant for his arrest for assault. It was very exciting for me. Now I mention this and I hear all of the other stories. My nefarious relative is my grandfather, who was the driver for the bootleg queen of Springfield, Massachusetts, when he was 16 years old. And he had the day off when they gunned her and their driver down in the car, so he was anxious for that. But I'm really excited, so stay tuned if you're listening. Stay tuned for that. And we're going to schedule open house days. We're going to start once a month, where we're going to open the Shaw Mansion. People can come in and look around. We're going to do walk-in genealogy, so you'll be able to walk in and we'll do genealogy with you. We'll pull out some pieces from the collection. We'll talk about programming and stuff like that. And we're going to start that with once a month. And as interest builds, we'll do it more often. So I think that's everything we've got going. For now, but stay tuned because there's going to be more. Okay? Thanks everybody for coming in here. We really appreciate you. Thank you so much. And thanks for everybody who actually watched us on this. We apologize for the bumpy ride. We apologize for the microphone gain, but we'll get it next time. We'll get it next time. So stay tuned. Keep an eye on our YouTube channel because you'll watch us fiddling around with it. You'll see us, and you might catch us swearing and yelling. It might be fun for you. It'll be fun for us. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, you went viral when you were in City Hall.